Today we talk about two guys who are guaranteed to be on the team next year, but their roles may look different. Talk about Matt Vierling and Reese Olson all today on Locked On Tigers.
You are Locked On Tigers, your daily Detroit Tigers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of Locked On Tigers. I'm, of course, your host, Scott Bentley. Today is Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024. Thank you so much for making Locked On Tigers your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Welcome in, everybody. Happy Hump Day, the halfway point in the week here. We are continuing our player breakdown series here as the Tigers season we've been doing since the Tigers season came to an end. I guess there was a little bit where we did like season recap stuff, but this has been all week this week, breaking down everybody on this roster, talking about the season they had in 2024 and kind of what the expectations are as we head into the winter and we head into the offseason this upcoming year. I was going to say in 2025, but that really starts in a few weeks, not, necessarily when the calendar turns over. So today we're going to talk about Matt Vierling and Reese Olson, two guys that I think both had pretty fascinating seasons for different reasons. And I always have a lot to say on Matt Vierling just because I think he's such a unique player. Some of it good, some of it bad, but I think I don't even want to use the word bad. Some of it, I don't know, positive, negative, whatever terminology you want to use, I guess. But Vierling had a really interesting year because I think the biggest conversation surrounding him is role on the team going forward, really more than anything else. And Reese Olson was good when he was healthy, but there's still some adjustments that have to be made. There's still a pretty big hole in his repertoire, which if you've listened to the show for any amount of time, you know what I'm going to say there when we get to it. He'll be in the rotation next year. His is just a matter of how high is the ceiling, right? When this dude's at his best, how good of a pitcher can he be? I think most of us believe that the ceiling is pretty darn high, but we'll talk about that. We're going to start off with Matt Vierling, though. This was a really solid season for Matty V. There's still plenty of things to nitpick, and I will nitpick them in this episode. And there's still areas to improve, but I just want, if you're a big Vierling defender and you listen to this and I'm maybe being a little too nitpicky or whatnot, just remember, I'm going to redirect you to the beginning of this conversation where I said I thought he had a pretty darn solid season. I just am not sure he will ever be a one position regular everyday player, but he showed his value consistently all season long. So let's get into where he excelled and where he struggled this season on the field. He hit .257 with a .312 on base percentage, a career high .423 slugging percentage, which helped him get a career high .735 OPS. He had a 2.6 WAR on Fangraphs. That is third on the team. The only players with more WAR on the Detroit Tigers in 2024 was Riley Green and Tarek Skubal. So among position players, obviously that makes him the second most quote-unquote valuable player. Now, Kerry Carpenter was a 10th of a win, 2/10 of a win away and played in about half of the games. So if there's a couple of guys behind him where if they got 100, if they had played as many games as Vierling, if they played in 140, 150, 160 games, you're talking about them way, blowing past Vierling's number. But the fact of the matter is he was second among position players in WAR this season. He had a career high 16 homers, career high 57 RBIs. He had more power against right-handed hitting, but more contact against pitching. He had more power against right-handed pitching, had more contact against left-handed pitching. And I think one of the first things that jumps out of the page at me with Vierling is that he had pretty similar splits from both sides of the plate. That's something that one way or another, whether it's struggling against righties or lefties, really from year to year, he's struggled to be consistent from both sides of the plate. So I give him a lot of credit for being pretty consistent from both sides. That's immensely valuable, especially again when this team platoons as much as they do and pinch hits as much as they do and whatnot. It's nice to have kind of a steady rock that you know is going to be about the same hitter from both sides. This year, Matt Vierling changed his approach and his mechanics, and I think it worked to an extent. The hands were not as far back in his stance. He had them kind of more toward the middle of his body in his stance, but also more importantly, in his load. His hands were in a much different spot, much lower, much easier to and quicker, most importantly, to get through the zone. He wasn't consistently late on high velocity like he was last year. He still somewhat was. If you look at his spray chart for, fastballs and high velocity pitches, it was still mostly opposite field. But, there's some of that's just going to come with being a major league hitter. Like if you face 100 consistently, it's hard to be on top of that all the time. So it was better. It still wasn't perfect, but it was better. The biggest change that these mechanics brought, though, was the improved power. And he had a career high in slug, like I talked about, easily career high in home runs. He had a nitro zone this year. He had an area where if you threw a non-fastball in that zone, it was going to get crushed. And that was low and inside. His stats against pitches low and in were absolutely incredible. And again, if you remove fastballs from that, if you just talk any breaking ball, any off speed, anything that wasn't high velo, low and in, was pretty much turned and destroyed by Vierling this year. And last year, one of my biggest complaints with Vierling was that he was a kind of a slap ball hitter almost. And I don't say that with like an extreme negative connotation, but he was consistently just hitting singles the opposite way. That's what Matt Vierling did. He would let the ball get really deep in the zone, almost to the catcher's glove. And then he would, again, the mechanics, it took him a longer time to get the bat through the zone, and he would just slap the ball the opposite way. This year, the mechanical changes he made, he was able to get out in front of the ball a little bit more, which led to much more power. And over the course of a full season, this is the most important part to me, the batting average was almost the same. And I know that everybody has a different opinion on batting average and how valuable it is and whatnot. In this context, in this conversation and situation, I think it's really nice to see he was within 4 points of his batting average from last year and raised the slug like 30 or 40 points. That's really, really impressive. And I think that that's a testament to the changes that he did make. I still think he needs to walk more. And I don't just say that just because everybody should walk more. There's no reason he shouldn't walk more. This guy is in the 89th percentile in chase rate and yet walks almost a whole percent below league average. He was in like the 39th percentile in baseball and just straight up walk rate. So I still am waiting for that. For a guy that lays off as many pitches as he does, and he also doesn't swing and miss. He has really good whiff rate numbers as well. I will continue to feel like he should walk more than he does. But this was a really solid year, and we saw him take a step forward across the board. One of the biggest reasons for this big year, I guess we'll call it. I don't want to make it sound like he was like an all-star or anything. He wasn't anything close to that, but he was an above average major league player. One of the biggest reasons was how good of a season he started off with. He really hit the ground running and had an unbelievable April and May. Okay, we'll talk about that and then kind of talk about the rest of the season, kind of the roller coaster that was 2024 for Vierling, rather. We will do that right after this. Got to talk to you today about our friends over at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place all of your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. All right, everybody, welcome back here. Segment 2, Locked On Tigers. Appreciate y'all for tuning in, as always, making us your first listen every single day. Shout out to the everydayers that do tune in every day. We will, of course, be back tomorrow as we continue our player breakdown series. And then again, as I always say, if there is any news that comes out of Tigers world, we will obviously address that immediately. It's the beauty of a daily show. We can pivot on a dime, call an audible anytime we want. Also, Mailbag Friday. So ask your questions on Thursday's show. Do not ask them on today's show. Do not ask them in the comments of today's video. Ask them tomorrow. Tomorrow's show. That's where you're going to ask your questions. Mailbag Friday will be a fun way to kind of send everybody into their weekend. Ask about this season. Ask about the off season. Whatever your heart desires. So we're talking about Matt Vierling. That's what my heart desires currently. How can you not? Good-looking gentleman there. So when we're talking about Vierling's season, as I mentioned before the break, really solid April, unbelievable May, though. This is a guy that hit over 300 with an OPS over 900, had the most home runs he hit in any month in May, had 21 RBIs in the month of May. That is ridiculous considering he had fewer than 60 RBIs on the season. So May was a very, very productive month. June is when the scouting report got out, and he hit under 200. He had an OPS in the 500s in the month of June, and he saw a lot less pitches in that nitro zone, and he saw a lot more fastballs up and away, because pitchers realized, A, he swings and misses. That's one of the only spots he consistently swings and misses is fastballs up and away. And even if he doesn't, he's not going to drive the ball. It's going to be slapped the opposite way, just like it was in 2023. And he struggled a lot at first, but he was able to recover and become, again, a relatively solid hitter in the second half of the season. The difference is, in the second half of the season, the slugging percentage dropped quite considerably. It was under 400. It was in the 390s, but it was sub 400 in the entire second half of the season, his slugging percentage. And he only hit 4 home runs in the entire second half. He ended with 16. Almost half of his RBIs were in May alone, as I addressed earlier. Right? A little bit less than that, but like 40% of his RBIs were in 1 month. So offensively, there is a lot to like here. And there was a lot of tangible, concrete adjustments that were made. And it is beautiful to see. Absolutely. Next year's his age 28 season. He still has plenty of time. He can continue developing. But I definitely do still worry about what may happen going forward if pitchers just decide they're not going to throw him low and in ever anymore. Right? He's going to have to make another adjustment and be able to drive the ball in other places besides just, sliders low and inside. And actually, speaking of that, if you look at his pitch chart on Baseball Savant, beautiful website, great resource. I encourage everybody to use it. You can look at where every single pitch was that was thrown to him this entire season. He got force-fed sliders low and away out of the zone. Because people knew that if he was thrown a slider low and in, he was going to be aggressive on those because he would crush it. So they were like, oh, here's a slider, but psych, it's low and away to try to get him to swing and miss. To his credit, he spit on a lot of them. But I do think that a lot of adjustments still need to be made here. He got really a lot of fastballs away and sliders low and away. And I think that he is going to have to make another adjustment now that report is out. But we saw proof that he can adjust, and I do really like what we saw from him most of this season. I think one of the biggest values, I guess I'll say, that Vierling provides this team is his versatility. And that's where we switch away from the offensive side of the ball and look at kind of everything else that he provides this team. He was a +1 outs above average in right field, a +2 in center field, a -1 in left field, and a 0 at third base and a 0 at first base. He was also a plus base runner. He can't steal bases, which absolutely drives me nuts because he's like in the top 10% in baseball, top 11% in baseball in sprint speed, and he can't steal. It drives me nuts. But alas, there's a lot of value he provides outside of the batter's box. solid defender. None of those. Even the left field was his worst one at -1. That's still like, a solid, almost net zero defender out there. This guy can provide average defense at 5 different positions, can hit about the same from both sides of the plate, and has a little bit of pop if you miss your spot and give him something in his favorite zone there low and in. This was a step forward for Matt Vierling all in all. I think there's still a lot of holes in his game, and I still think there's serious conversations about his role on the team going forward, which we will have at the end of this episode here in segment 3. But I think my biggest thing is I like the player, I like the profile. He just shouldn't be like a middle of the lineup bat for you next season, which I feel like is somewhat self-explanatory, but that is, he was a middle of the lineup bat in the playoffs this year. Nonetheless, the second half of the regular season, he had a sub 400 slug in that time. He didn't hit well in the playoffs, right? So I think that's really my biggest thing. And we'll get a little bit more specific with his role later on in the show. Let's talk Reese Olson. Reese Olson is disgusting. How can you not love Reese? 3.53 ERA, a 1.18 whip. He also had 2.4 FWAR, so just a hair below Matt Vierling's 2.6. Had a 21.7% K rate and a 7.1% walk rate. This dude absolutely rocks. It really felt like this year was everything was either a swing and a miss or it was a ground ball. And that is pretty much exactly what every team wants a starting pitcher to be in today's day and age of baseball, right? You either get strikeouts, those are the most valuable because it is the most, you are in control the most, right? There's no error can happen, a seeing eye single, whatever. It's a guaranteed out there. But if you're not going to strike somebody out, you want to keep the ball on the ground because that is also the least amount of damage. You're usually talking about a single at worst. That is what he was. He was in the 87th percentile in chase rate, the 74th percentile in whiff rate, and the 86th percentile in ground ball rate. That is chef's kiss. Absolutely beautiful. We saw most of his value through his slider, which is not a surprise to anybody that has ever watched Reese Olson pitch in a Major League Baseball game. And it's more than just his best pitch. It is now turning into one of, I would call it borderline elite. I think it is entering that territory of like a truly top end in all of the American League type of pitch. It had a 143 batting average against it, a 194 slug against it, and a whiff rate of 45%. Almost half of the time somebody at the major league level swung at his slider, it was a swing and miss. That is absolutely phenomenal. His changeup was really solid as well. Very good numbers against, 42% whiff rate on that. Also phenomenal, right? The notable omission here so far is very clearly the conversation of his fastball. And that has been something that we have talked about on this show since he was in the minor leagues. Legitimately, I can remember talking about Reese Olson's fastball and how I wanted it to improve back when he was pitching in Toledo 2 years ago. And I think that this season, it's so weird that really, I was trying to find a better way to word it, but I don't think there is. It's just weird. He pumps 95 miles an hour and can't get swing and miss on it. 10% whiff rate on his fastball this year. Hitters hit almost 280 against it, and it had a really high hard hit rate. It got hit hard as well. So this is like the frustration of frustrated. Like he was really good. I love him to death. I'm not trying to say I'm like pissed off at this. He's still a really good pitcher despite this. But like this in lies a little bit of the frustration with having elite swing and miss stuff, and yet his strikeout rate is in the 39th percentile. He's 11% below league average in strikeouts, despite having 2 pitches with above 40% whiff rates. He just can't finish off hitters with his fastball, and that's an issue that he continues to run into in his major league career. Let's talk about the sinker, which kind of throws a little bit of a wrench, a curveball, no pun intended, into his repertoire as well. And then we'll talk about both of these players' roles in 2025. We will do that right after this. Got to talk to y'all today about our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money on sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to everyone. You just pick more or less on at least 2 player stat projections, and you could win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks. They have so many great offers at Prize Picks as well. My favorite, as I mention all the time, is the injury insurance policy. If a player gets hurt in the first half of a game and doesn't return in the second half, your play stays alive. There's also a lot of really fun other offers. There's a communities tab where you can just look at celebrities, Sean O'Malley, Joe Budden, etc., who are a part of the Prize Picks community and the plays that they have on any given day. So join all of the fun and all of the action over at Prize Picks. Download the app and use code LOCKEDONMLB, and you can get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's Locked On MLB on the Prize Picks app to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. All right, everybody, welcome back. Your third and final segment of Locked On Tigers. Appreciate y'all for tuning in, as always. So we were talking about Reese Olson's repertoire before the break, and I want to mention his sinker because I want to make that a notable difference between four-seam fastball and sinker. He threw the sinker quite a lot this season to mitigate that inability to get swing and miss on his fastball, right? And it worked because the sinker is not a swing and miss pitch anyway. And it is going to get hit hard as well, just like his fastball did. But at least the sinker is almost guaranteed to be on the ground. And his sinker moves a ton. It's a really good pitch. I think it was his second most valuable pitch in his entire repertoire this year. Thus, the ground ball rate. His sinker had a ground ball rate. That pitch in a vacuum had a ground ball rate of over 50%. That is, as a whole, his entire repertoire included, just his whole season, he had a higher ground ball rate than Jason Foley, who we talked about earlier in the week. So Reese Olson absolutely rocks. I do not want this to come across as like he's not a good pitcher or something because his fastball doesn't get swing and miss sometimes. It's just the only thing standing in his way from being a legit front of the rotations talent. It's just the fastball effectiveness. That's really the only thing standing in his way. Everything else he does well. He can get a ground ball anytime he wants. He can locate really well. He has good command of his secondary. His secondary are elite swing and miss pitches. To me, there's just no reason that a guy pumping 95 with the movement he has shouldn't be able to get those swings and misses, which is why I continue to harp on it throughout his career. But we'll see what he does in the offseason. We'll see what kind of program they have him on, and we'll see how he looks coming into spring training. We'll end the show by talking about these guys' roles in 2025. For starters, just really quickly, because it's fairly obvious, both of these guys should and will be back in spring training of 2025. If they're not, it's because of some huge trade that nobody is talking about right now. But just in terms of like, are they going to return? Yes, and they're both going to be prominent parts of the 2025 Detroit Tigers as well. Vierling had a solid year, as we talked about, but as I also said at the beginning, I don't see him being a one-position everyday player on this team going forward. I think we almost all, as a community and a fan base, want a true, new, like regular, everyday third baseman going forward. That's something that this team has not had since Jeimer Candelario left, I think is probably fair to say. And if Vierling's then a pure outfielder, right, if you do get a third baseman, he's not going to be like a pure everyday outfielder either, because you have Parker Meadows. He's not playing over Parker. Riley Green, he's sure as heck not playing over him. And then Kerry Carpenter. At most, if he was strictly ruled to the outfield, he would just be the other half of the Kerry Carpenter platoon in right field. So what do you do with him? I worded what I said there very carefully. One position everyday regular. I think he can and should be a regular everyday player for the Detroit Tigers, or close to it at least. But he'll be a Swiss Army knife, right? Like, remember what Ben Zobrist was there for the Cubs that one year, where he just at one point in his career, he just said, you know what, I'm going to play 150 games and be an all-star at it. And I'm not saying Matt Vierling's going to be an all-star, but I'm saying that, having that ability to, no matter, if Hinch plays matchups a lot, if he likes the matchup for Vierling that day, he can slot him in somewhere. He can play 5 different positions. That's very valuable. He can be a solid hitter in the bottom half of the lineup, run the bases really well, be a constant pinch hitter late in games from both, no matter what handedness is on the mound too. That's very valuable. Like, again, pinch runner, pinch fielder, like defensive sub, whatever the role is, he can fill almost all of them. And that is very, very valuable. He can play 140 plus games in that role and still be an everyday player without us penciling him in as, he's the starting everyday third baseman or first baseman or right field, left field, center field, what have you. And this isn't anything that Vierling has done, like, quote unquote wrong per se. This is more about wanting the lineup to just get better, right? Like he's around a 740 OPS guy that's above league average. That shouldn't be a 3 or 4 hitter for a legitimate high-end offense. If you want this offense to be legitimate next season, Matt Vierling cannot be a 2 through 4 hitter on like opening day in this lineup, period. Like just point blank, under no circumstance. But he'd be a really dang good 6 or 7 hitter that provides versatility all over the roster. And he was one of the more valuable players on the team this year for a reason. When it comes to Reese Olson, it's a lot, I think, shorter of a conversation, to be honest. It's pretty self-explanatory. He's going to be in the rotation to start off the year in 2025. This is more about how good he can become. What is the ceiling here? I think one of those questions right now is that pertains to that is how many innings can you realistically rely on him for, right? The most that he has thrown at any level in a single season is 119. So I think that's still a really big question mark, but this dude has just continued to exceed expectations. He wasn't really known when they first acquired him. And then he was a projected reliever because he had really good slider and iffy fastball. Then he was maybe a back end starter after he improved a little bit in his call-up year. And, now we're talking about what he has to change to be a top half of the rotation type of player on a good team. And if he was on a worse team, which feels great to say that finally you can just be like, yeah, there are plenty of worse teams than the Detroit Tigers out there. If he was on a worse team, he'd probably be a top 2 in a rotation. He's only 25 years old still. He only has 2 years of major league experience. He'll keep getting better, and I think next year really should be a huge year for him if he can stay on the field. Just imagine, you're going to have Job a lot more in the fold next year. You obviously have Skubal. Maybe you go out and get another starting pitcher in free agency as well. Like, imagine how good your rotation is if Reese Olson is your 4 or 5 starter. That indicates that you have a really nasty and deep rotation at the major league level. I think that's pretty much it. I tried to walk the line as best I could with Vierling. He's just a grab bag. There's a lot to like. There's still a lot that is kind of not to like. But as a whole, I think he's just one of the more fascinating players on this roster because of that, because of the ups and downs that he has in his game. But I tried to walk that line of like, this was a good year. I really like what I saw from him. I think he can be very valuable next year. It's just like everyday regular at third baseman. No thanks. So we'll see what happens this winter. But I think both of these guys are going to be key parts to this team's success in 2025 if they are to take another step forward. Thanks for making Locked On Tigers your first listen every single day. Shout out to the everydayers that do tune in every day. We will, of course, be back tomorrow. Ask your questions on tomorrow's show. Not this one, not this one, not this one. Tomorrow's show. And we will have a mailbag on Friday. We'll have a player breakdown or 2 or 3 tomorrow. Peace and love. Going to therapy's dope. I'll catch y'all then, baby. Go Tigers.